Thanks. Can we have the lights? This is the man I've come to talk about. I don't know how old he was when he painted these, but your guess is as good as mine. This is him he was born in 1830, and this is him in 1875 with his wife, Julie. And this is the man in 1895. Probably the image that many people have of him. I just want to mention that his work is best seen, well, as most painting is best seen in the flesh, and in his case, up close. So I tried to make the best of the images I could cull, but you really have to, more than any painter I know, you really have to get next to his work and look at it. And that's how I discovered it too. I thought, wait a minute, it's not letting me walk away. I have to look at it more and more. In 1891, the young painter Henry van der Velde wrote to the 61-year-old Camille Pissarro concerning a lecture he was writing about Pissarro. The letter begins, "Much revered master." Then follows the bulk of the letter, and then, "But I am afraid, master, of being too little informed about your work. It has taken me a long time to pluck up the courage to apply to you, but that only testifies to the distance between the place you occupy in my admiration and my own humility. It's hard to imagine such a letter today, but it reveals the esteem for Pissarro in the avant-garde of his day. Should we not explore this discontinuity? What would this exploration reveal?" Van der Velde's letter was to convey to his mainly Belgian audience a great deal about Pissarro's role in the avant-garde and the creation of modern art. Van der Velde himself went on to become an important architect and one of the inventors of Art Nouveau. Recognizing the effort Van der Velde gave to this lecture in his formative years, one might feel obliged to consider Pissarro's influence on, for example, Art Nouveau. For over a century, Paul Cézanne has been considered the father of modern art. His ascendancy, which began in earnest around 1895, had a tidal influence on the development of the avant-garde, leading to both abstraction and expressionism. Commanding the fealty of Picasso and Matisse, dominating the standard narrative of the development of modernism through the late 20th century and lingering today. By the way, if I don't say whose painting it is, it's a Pissarro. If it's some other artist, I'll tell you. We'll be showing a few other artists' work. But things did not always look this way. For most of the late 19th century, it was not Cézanne, but Camille Pissarro who was revered as the greater master and as one of the most influential creators of modern art, with a uniquely rich personality that added to his art and to his role. Yet even in his own time, his contributions and achievements were not fully grasped. Well, we have the first one in the wrong place. Thanks to the twists of history, Pissarro's reputation subsequently ebbed to the point where he came to be recalled, often dismissively, as a vaguely important and skillful landscapist among the Impressionists, and dimly as the first great Jewish modern artist. Over the past quarter century, in a quiet counter-movement, Pissarro's significance has been revived. Essays and major international exhibitions have shed new light on his achievement and suggested that Cézanne's own career would not have been possible without the precedence of Pissarro. Recently abetting this trend has been a vibrant exhibition organized this past summer at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, curated by Joachim Pissarro, Camille Pissarro's great-grandson, who is also now a senior curator at the Modern. It is now at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and will be at the Musée d'Orsay next year. There is another major Pissarro show currently in Australian museums. From 1861 until the mid-1880s, Pissarro and Cézanne carried on a deep artistic and personal interaction that indeed had a determining effect on the future of art. Their interaction is the subject of the MoMA exhibit. The high quality of all the work in the MoMA show is itself a statement in our era, which has embraced the low in art. MoMA is venturing farther back into history than usual and upholding the anti-academic art of the 19th century, thereby repairing some of the damage done by postmodern revisionism to this period and to our own. This Pissarro-Cézanne relationship has sometimes been framed as Pissarro the brilliant teacher freeing Cézanne the brilliant student to make his great discoveries. Pissarro certainly did help Cézanne, but open-eyed study will show that Pissarro made the discoveries first in works of the highest possible achievement. Despite its many virtues, the MoMA show does not by itself illumine the full story of the relationship between these artists, or the full story of Pissarro himself, nor does it really make clear how to appreciate Pissarro's work. Most cultured eyes still see early modern art, including Pissarro's, through a Cézanne-derived screen, and a whole understanding of the modernist movement in art follows from this perception. Is it right? Over 50 years ago, the abstract expressionist painter Barnett Newman complained that the Museum of Modern Art, the temple of modernism in art, had dedicated itself to the proposition that Cézanne was the father of modern art, with Marcel Duchamp as his self-appointed heir. In so doing, Newman declared, the museum was perpetuating a false history. There is much to Newman's charge. In the last half of the 19th century, a supreme century for painting, Camille Pissarro's influence was pervasive in the avant-garde in Paris, perhaps the liveliest cultural center in the world. He was the linchpin. One small Pissarro painting of 1874, a curator wrote in 1989, emanates a power that continues through the rest of 19th century French art. He was referring to this painting, Potato Harvest. This painting, by the way, is only about 14 inches wide, maybe less. Pissarro I have tried so hard to find out why the machine makes that noise, but I'm not able to do it. Pissarro himself had the longest active presence in that art world. He was a significant figure on the scene for almost 50 years, from soon after his arrival in 1855 to his death in 1903. Born in 1830, he was the eldest of the Impressionists, older even than Edouard Manet. He was born on the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean, a child of successful middle-class Jewish merchants originally from Bordeaux. Schooled in Paris from 1841 to 1847, he went back to the island to enter the family business, but eventually ignored his family's expectations and went off to draw and paint in Venezuela for a couple of years. He returned to Paris for good in 1855. Not long after, his parents transferred their lives and business to Paris. In the late 1850s, Pissarro drew at the Académie Suisse, an independent studio where artists could work from the model without guidance or interference. Previous clients of this studio included Delacroix, Bonington, and Courbet. The 19-year-old Monet found his way here in 1859 and struck up a friendship with Pissarro. In 1861 or two, the 22-year-old Cézanne, fresh from Provence, entered the Suisse. In 1860, Pissarro had begun a liaison with Julie Velay, his mother's cook's assistant. They married in 1871, had 8 children, 3 of whom died young, and remained together until Camille's death. The relationship cost him a large portion of his mother's affections and financial support. As a consequence, most of Pissarro's adult life would be a dire struggle for money. But his open and defiant commitment to Julie was an early example of the personal and artistic independence for which he became known. Indeed, it provided a shelter for his friends Cézanne and Monet and their mistresses during the family storms caused by their own premarital liaisons. After the mid-1860s, Pissarro lived in small towns just outside of Paris, where living was less costly and his favored rural motifs lay nearby. Many artists came out to visit and work near him, most notably Monet for 6 months in 1869-70, and Cézanne and Gauguin in the 1870s and 80s. Of Camille and Julie's children, several became artists themselves, most prominently Lucien, the eldest son. Pissarro's letters to Lucien are a fascinating trove of insight into a painter's life and into the history of 19th century art. And they have been published in English, or most of them. Yeah. Pissarro was 25 when he returned to Paris from the Caribbean, already an experienced landscape painter and free of the stultifying conventions of the French academies. Cézanne later related that Pissarro told me he had the good fortune to be born in the Antilles, where he learned to draw without a teacher. During the late sorry, Graham. Present company excluded. These were different teachers we're referring to in the French Academy. During the late 1850s, Pissarro sought out his great predecessors in French art. He took Corot, Courbet, and Delacroix in almost equal dosages. Influenced by them, but never a disciple, he integrated what he learned into his own vision. And conveniently, in 1855 and 56, Pissarro lived along the same block of the Rue Notre-Dame de Lorette, on which Delacroix kept his studio. In the 1860s, at the same time as Edouard Manet, who is usually regarded as the first modern artist, Pissarro developed a new approach. His emphasizing the full, direct response of the artist to the nature in which he exists, which includes himself. Manet was, of course, a great innovative painter and very influential in the 1860s, perhaps the only painter of the second half of the 19th century to rival Pissarro in completeness of painting culture. Yet part of Manet's influence undoubtedly came from his high social standing and ability to finance his own shows. Pissarro, it seems to me, covered more artistic ground than Manet and had greater, if less celebrated, impact on the other artists for a longer time. Pissarro himself said he was not influenced by Manet. Pissarro's intentions were idiosyncratic. As the curator Christopher Lloyd discreetly put it, his work has a slightly different complexion from that of his associates. Pissarro's significance was recognized early on by his peers and fitfully by officialdom. When one of his unorthodox landscapes was accepted for the 1859 Salon, it was earlier than this one, it was hidden near the ceiling. Still, it was noted appreciatively by the critic Alexandre Astrut. By the early 1860s, Pissarro's work was already a model to the younger experimental artists, a role he had also assumed through his avid participation in the professional social life of the studios and cafes, where new art was hotly discussed. In 1863, his participation in the Salon des Refusés, a broad protest against the official salon, cemented this link, but also made him more notorious to the conservative art public. But his work was so strong that despite the official loathing, it was accepted for the salons of 1864, 65, and 66. In his review of the last of these, Émile Zola, the great novelist and art critic and a supporter of the avant-garde, wrote about Pissarro. "Thank you, sir. Your winter landscape, this painting, refreshed me for a good half hour during my trip through the great desert of the Salon. I know that you were admitted only with great difficulty. Another critic found in Pissarro's 1866 Salon the raw and unadulterated truth. In the same year, the painter Antoine Guillemet would write to the painter Francisco Oller, Pissarro alone continues to produce masterpieces. Oller, incidentally, was a teacher of Cézanne around this time. These early responses indicate clearly enough that Pissarro was creating something unusual. In fact, he was inventing abstraction, the ingredients of which he had gleaned from his precursors. As early as 1864, he was using elements of landscape as abstract designs, making lines and shapes be lines and shapes, as well as representations of objects and scenic depth. The winter landscape, to which Zola referred, banks of the Marne in winter, is a prime example, this painting. In the MoMA show, it is full of the abstraction Pissarro was inventing. The trees on the left of the painting are an essay of lines. The houses on the right make up a play of triangular and trapezoidal shapes. The entire lower right quadrant is a kind of color field painting, concerned with the communicative powers of color and brushstroke, independent of what they depict. The smudges of paint on the far right, standing in for houses, declare that smudges of paint carry qualities of beauty in their own right. Remember, a lot is lost in a photograph. You have to get right up close to these real paintings themselves. Several late 20th century writers have appreciated the non-narrative qualities of Pissarro's painting. A dexterity, I'm going to quote a bunch of them, a dexterity of physical application of paint, powerful brushstroke, there we go. The visual opulence, a closed world of miraculous color contrasts and multifarious brushstrokes, breathtakingly painterly. There is something almost culinary about the way the material of the paint has been applied and manipulated on the surface of the work. The variety and richness of plastic possibilities. He committed himself to juggle with a whole new range of plastic combinations and spatial constructions. Dynamic transitions and passages and interferences of shades. In addition to conveying a view of nature, and in addition to being visual essays or poems or symphonies made up of lines, colors, and forms, Pissarro's paintings were an expression of his own ideas and feelings. That is, the way he painted, his brushstrokes, his facture, made the viewer aware of the emotions of a specific person at a specific moment in time. In the avant-garde of that era, there was a great deal of interest in the new expression of the self in art. Terms like temperament, and sensation were gaining currency, particularly in descriptions of Pissarro's art. As Zola would write of him in a review of the Salon of 1868, the originality here is profoundly human. It is not derived from a certain facility of hand or from a falsification of nature. It stems from the very temperament of the painter himself and comprises a feeling for truth resulting from an inner conviction. Never before have paintings appeared to me to possess such an overwhelming dignity. For that Salon, the sum of published critical praise from critics sympathetic to the new artist, new painter's aims, seemed to single out Pissarro. Among them, Odilon Redon, whom we recall as an important symbolist artist, and whose work is being shown in this city right now, had this to say in his review. Several years ago, we noticed this intense and austere personality. What a singular talent. We are certain that public opinion will soon pronounce itself in favor of this authentic, who for a long time has pursued his aim with an impassive conviction in all the marks of what is called temperament. Such a strong opinion might give one pause to consider the effect Pissarro had on Redon's development as an artist. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, Monet, Renoir, Bazille, Sisley, and Pissarro pursued new ideas about painting, working together like, in Pissarro's words, mountaineers roped together at the waist. In 1869, Pissarro painted along the Seine with Monet and Renoir, engaged by the colored shapes presented by the water's reflections. This was a crucial moment in the development of modern art, and the paintings, especially Renoir's and Monet's, are justly famous. Pissarro's role at this birthplace of Impressionism has been sadly obscured, probably by the fact that nearly all of his paintings from this time are lost. In the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians occupied and trashed Pissarro's home, destroying an estimated 1,500 pieces, 20 years' work. The dates of most of the few paintings from 1868-70 that survive are uncertain. This painting is from 1871, but it gives an idea of, in fact, he painted it when he was in exile in England. Interestingly, little has come down to us about the effect of this loss on Pissarro. He seems to have just continued on, glad to be alive, to be with his family and his art milieu, and able to paint, and consumed by the ongoing problems of staying that way. He and his family had escaped to London, and he had turned his exile there to good effect. But his apparently stoic reaction upon returning to the horrible fate of his work must have contributed to his special repute. Monet has often been represented as the genius of Impressionism, and a genius he certainly was. This is not Monet, this is Pissarro. He was also the instigator of the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. Nevertheless, in a review of that show, the critic Armand Sylvestre could refer to Pissarro as basically the inventor of this painting, meaning Impressionism. One is beginning to see why and how. Because of Monet, Impressionism came to be thought of, somewhat erroneously, as an art of color and light, an art in which structure and composition played lesser roles. But Pissarro's Impressionist landscapes and townscapes of the 1870s are a different story. Justly celebrated for their observation of light, color, and atmosphere, for the natural appearance of the people and places in them, and his elaborate but specific brushwork, these commanding lyrical works also extend the artist's exploration of structure and composition. Not the only aspect of painting in which he at least equaled his peers, but the one in which they most clearly suffer by comparison. This process of visual dissection, one observes in these paintings, the phrase is Christopher Lloyd's in his 1981 monograph on Pissarro, is Pissarro's particular triumph, and it makes Monet's paintings, beautiful as they are, look picturesque and simplistic by comparison. Not for nothing did Zola insist that Pissarro is a fiercer revolutionary than Monet. In 1873, the critic Théodore Duret wrote to Pissarro, "Don't think of Monet and Sisley. You'll be going along a new road as far and as high as any master." And Cézanne, too, not only observed that Monet is only an eye, but what an eye, he also maintained that Pissarro was the inventor of Impressionism. Pissarro himself had this to say of Monet in 1891. Monet's marvelous sunsets, they seemed to me very luminous and masterful. That was undeniable. But since for our own cultivation we ought to look beyond the given,
I asked myself, what seems to be missing? Certainly it is not a matter of justesse or harmony. It is some want of unity of execution, or perhaps a less ephemeral vision. The colors are more pretty than strong. The drawing is beautiful but too indefinite, drifting, especially in the backgrounds. Still, it is the work of a very great artist. A critic in La Revue Blanche in 1899 referred to Monet as perpetually the ravished slave of his first impression, and in the same article called Pissarro a reflective visionary. In 1989, the curator Richard Bretel concluded, Pissarro's place in the history of 19th century French art is more secure and more important than that of Monet. But look at Pissarro's fate in the years between these highs. In 1929, when Alfred Barr, the first and most influential director of the then brand new Museum of Modern Art, delineated the greats of modern art, Pissarro was absent from the list. And what of Cézanne and Pissarro? For over 20 years from the time they met in 1861, Cézanne sought and received Pissarro's advice and help. The young Cézanne's is on my right, and Pissarro's on my left. In other words, this is Cézanne, in case there's any question. The young Cézanne, awkward in art as in person, was ridiculed in Paris, but not by Pissarro, who perhaps seeing something of himself in the impolitic frankness of the younger man's work, recognized his unusual talent immediately and never faltered in his support, Cézanne's greatest. This work is from 1874, 3, or 2, in that vicinity. He called Cézanne's early work, earlier than this, five-legged sheep, extraordinarily strange pieces seen in a unique way. Cézanne. The two became close friends. By the early 1870s, Cézanne was so eager to work in Pissarro's company that he moved near him. That they influenced each other is beyond doubt. We were always together, Pissarro wrote of those years, when the volatile Cézanne's attachment was intense. In particular, Pissarro's obsessive approach to work, to minding his own vision, helped release Cézanne from his own personality blockages, showing him how emotional content could come on its own, and allowing him to channel his anxious energy into the formal problems of painting. From Pissarro, Cézanne, now we're looking at Pissarro, Cézanne learned abstraction. To see and use forms independently from what they depict. To use the constructive and expressive little brushstroke. To emphasize form rather than sentiment, and that you can make form with color alone, without outline, leaving line for its own expressive possibilities. Cézanne is quoted as saying that it was Pissarro who replaced modeling with values of light and dark by the use of color. Where would modern art be without this, possibly its very basis? In the mid-1870s, Cézanne began a long seclusion in his native Aix, near the Mediterranean. This is back to a Pissarro painting. Removing himself from the Paris scene almost entirely. From the South in 1876, he wrote these now famous sentences to Pissarro. It's like a playing card. Red roofs against a blue sea. He was acknowledging that he was painting the roofs, walls, fields, and water as flat, abstract forms dominated by shape and color, as Pissarro had painted 10 years earlier, as Pissarro had taught him. This is 1867 landscape, which is also an essay in rectangles, parallelograms, slabs of color. Pissarro's influence on Cézanne cannot be overestimated, wrote Françoise Cachin, director of the Musée de France, in 1995. This is in the catalog of a major Cézanne exhibition. The catalog contains numerous attributions of Pissarro as the source of Cézanne's techniques. During the long years prior to Cézanne's breakthrough, Pissarro provided virtually all the exposure for his work. He encouraged this is Pissarro. He encouraged the merchant Père Tanguy to show Cézanne's work at his paint shop gallery and urged collectors and artists to see it there. Later, he convinced a new art dealer, the soon-to-be famous Ambroise Vollard, to give Cézanne the 1895 show that made both their names. Later in life, Cézanne said that Pissarro was like a father to me. He was a man you turned to for advice, and he was something like le bon Dieu, the good Lord. One can see Cézanne perhaps intimidated by this divinity. At MoMA, Pissarro's awesome kitchen garden of 1877, this painting, was hung next to Cézanne's painting of the same subject in the same year. The Garden of Maubuisson. Cézanne's version has its beauty because of his innate painter's sense, but it also feels, when seen with the Pissarro, like a sketch, a few notations of musical ideas. By contrast, the Pissarro has the force of a great symphony. It is as if Cézanne couldn't stand the pressure of Pissarro's strength and just threw in the towel. In the late 1870s, Cézanne's technique was evolving into repetitive arrangements of strokes. We've seen this painting before. This is Pissarro. His famous so-called constructive stroke technique was implied in many earlier Pissarro paintings, including in the MoMA show, The Potato Harvest of 1874, and explosively, L'Hermitage in Summer, Pontoise, 1877, an astonishing composition dense with essays of brushstroke and the poetry of color planes. But except for a few paintings that explicitly test Cézanne's technique, Pissarro never really adopted it, preferring instead to give individual meaning to every moment and stroke in the composition. Gauguin weighed in on this issue in 1881, writing to Pissarro while still ardently under his influence. Has Monsieur Cézanne found the exact formula for a work acceptable to everyone? If he discovers the prescription for compressing the intense expression of all his sensations into a single and unique procedure, try to make him talk in his sleep by giving him one of those mysterious homeopathic drugs and come immediately to Paris to share it with us. Pissarro was known to use homeopaths. Of course, at the time, conventional medicine was not very far along. Does this prescription of a single and unique procedure ring a bell? To me, it is echoed by the limitations of late 20th century art. To be sure, Cézanne's marks add up. Every spot in his mature painting of which that is one, 1894, is oriented toward the frontal impact of the whole, with the overall tension of the surface creating the sense of flatness that carried so much influence in the later development of abstract art. In the viewer's perception, everything in a Cézanne painting pushes forward, all the marks of paint moving together like lattice work. This forward push of the thin pulsating surface came more and more to be the dominant note in Cézanne's paintings, but one that was achieved at the cost of his own declared wish to make out of Impressionism something solid and durable like the art of museums. Cézanne acknowledged this cost. Writing that coloring sensations force me to produce abstract passages that stop me from covering my whole canvas or from pushing to the full delineation of objects. In other words, he could not complete the paintings as scenes or as recognizable objects because he had already completed them as compositions of purely visual events. With all the techniques of abstraction he had learned from Pissarro, Cézanne richly enforced the flatness. But he did not see, or could not or would not use these techniques in a larger context as Pissarro did. Pissarro's paintings, by contrast, have tremendous depth. They invite you in. You can enter and breathe and look around, in the abstraction as well as in the depicted scene, as if taking a tour of the artist's thought process. To maintain the spatial fullness of the old masters, Pissarro got the impact of the whole without sacrificing the local, using abstract compositions of great detail, variation, and colorism within the whole, and narrative and perspectival cues to balance the flattening effects of his abstraction. Despite the reputation of Cézanne, the modernity of the impact of the whole, as seen in Pissarro, was not lost to all later painters. Fantastic, absolute totality, Barnett Newman observed in front of a Uccello. One image, Courbet and Pissarro are like that, he said. Certainly Cézanne saw the solid and durable in his own old master, Pissarro. A Pissarro painting is the more complex and perfect. True, this kind of detailed completeness may make Pissarro's work difficult for the viewer. It has been observed that on short acquaintance, these paintings might appear to be too uniform, but then they draw you in. The person who made that comment was talking about Pissarro's late paintings of urban scenes, but I think it applies to many of his other of his paintings. To really get them, you must look closely at them. But Pissarro's fullness, warmth, and solidity are not what later painters, with perhaps one exception, got from the early modern abstract artists, or what became the accepted taste of the 20th century. Instead, they got Cézanne's flatness and assertion of flat, thin color, often without the high quality of painting that made Cézanne's own work so convincing. Posterity also mistook Cézanne's reductiveness in pursuit of his goal. The reductiveness in itself, cold and exclusive, became accepted taste in the later 20th century. The bizarreness of Cézanne's temperament also was taken up as a signal of avant-gardeness. Pissarro, too, exploited his own temperament, as we have seen, but his was large, warm, inclusive. These melodious symphonies, Georges Leconte called his paintings in the 1890s. Pissarro's persona was more whole than Cézanne's. Can we say it was more healthy? He was, in a word, a mensch, a state of being that held little appeal in the art fashions of the 20th century. Cézanne called him the humble and colossal Pissarro. Pissarro himself said he was after, and pardon my French, l'unité que l'esprit humain donne à la vision, which translates something like the unity that the human spirit gives to vision, or to the vision. And to get it, he said, s'interroger soi-même pour affirmer dans l'œuvre ses sentiments intimes, c'est à la recherche de cette unité intellectuelle que je mets tous mes soins. I ask myself to affirm my work's intimate feelings, or to affirm, yes, my work's intimate feelings. It is to the search for this intellectual unity that I put all my cares. Françoise Cachin also wrote in the Cézanne catalogue, Pissarro was possessed of a remarkable eye that led him to appreciate the genius of Cézanne, Gauguin, and Seurat before all other painters. This is unquestionably true, and it applies to more painters than she named. Gauguin was Pissarro's protege for many years, and for years painted like him. Gauguin's mature work, seemingly very different from Pissarro's, is full of the latter's inventions and perceptions. For example, the flat-colored figures emphasizing contour. There's an example there. In a rambling essay dated 1902 or 3, Gauguin, who had usually promoted only himself and had publicly rejected Pissarro by the late 1880s, wrote of him, examining Pissarro's work as a whole, despite its fluctuations, in which he remained always Pissarro, we find not only an overwhelming artistic will that never fails, but an essentially intuitive and pure art. He paid attention to everyone, you may say. Well, why not? Everyone paid attention to him, too, but denied it. He was one of my masters, and I do not deny him. About Gauguin's mature style, Pissarro had his doubts. He wrote in 1893, Gauguin assured me that the young would find salvation by replenishing themselves at remote and savage sources. I told him that this art did not belong to him, that he was a civilized man, and hence it was his function to show us harmonious things. Gauguin is certainly not without talent, but how difficult it is for him to find his own way. He is always poaching on someone's ground. Now he is pillaging the natives of Oceania. Gauguin's comment brings up the subject of innovation, which characterizes Pissarro's work from beginning to end. Yet rather than being valorized and canonized for it, it is, after all, supposedly a very essence of modernism, he was often diminished for it. Odd. Still, the litterateur Gustave Geoffroy wrote of Pissarro in 1898, there is something utterly touching and beautiful about this artist. It is the example of his perpetual renewal. Christopher Lloyd, 82 years later, refers to Pissarro's perpetual desire to revise his style of painting. But he also emphasizes that few painters have been so resolute and determined in their aims. His importance was that he remained a constant in a period of great change, and he was able to come to terms with originality, being quick to detect hypocrisy. In chiding the laggard appreciation in 1959, in chiding the laggard appreciation for Hans Hofmann, Clement Greenberg addressed a similar problem. A good share of the blame, Greenberg wrote, rests with the public of advanced art, which has its own kind of laziness and obtuseness, and usually asks that a difficult artist confine himself to a single readily identifiable manner before it will take trouble with him. By the way, Greenberg elsewhere wrote of Pissarro, only someone who has experienced painting as a world in which it is possible to immerse as well as divert oneself, he wrote in the mid-40s, can appreciate the inflections of Pissarro's painting. Shock and immediate effects are sacrificed for the sake of subtleties, he adds. And little masterpieces are to be found complete in themselves in the dozen or so brushstrokes with which such a detail as a cab is indicated. Vincent van Gogh, the needy genius who arrived in Paris in 1886 to study the advanced painters, soon spent time with Pissarro, the most generous of them. Vincent's brother Theo, an art dealer who had preceded his brother to Paris, had the insight to try to sell Pissarro's work and knew him well. Vincent, who until he got to Paris had been painting with hardly any color, certainly pinpointed a major source of his own mature style when he wrote, "What Pissarro says is true. You must boldly exaggerate the effects of either harmony or discord which colors produce." You can see something of the Van Gogh to come in Pissarro's Kitchen Garden of 1877, which we saw earlier, or this painting, Old Houses at Eragny of 1885. Perhaps these were among the Pissarros that Theo kept in his gallery and exhibited, and Vincent may have seen. Those chairs look familiar to fans of Van Gogh, I would think. It was Pissarro, of course this painting has so much structure in it besides those interesting chairs. There's so many plays on rectangles and planes and circles. It was Pissarro who was largely responsible for Van Gogh spending his last weeks in the care of Dr. Gachet. In fact, Madame Pissarro wouldn't have Vincent staying in the house, in the Pissarro household. They had a lot of children. Theo's death, less than 6 months after Vincent's, was a major blow to Pissarro's commercial hopes. I am poorly understood, especially since Theo Van Gogh died, Pissarro wrote to his son Lucien in 1891, what it is to have the influence of an enthusiast on your side. Theo and Vincent were very close, we know, and Theo's enthusiasm for Pissarro would have made a strong impression on his vulnerable brother Vincent. Nor were Gauguin and Van Gogh the end of it. In the mid to late 1880s, Pissarro was devastatingly accused of aping the neo-impressionism and pointillism of the much younger Seurat and Signac. This is Pissarro's Père Melon of 1879. But Pissarro did not follow them, he led them. Although Seurat certainly had his own sensibility and was assuredly a great artist, all of his work's stylistic attributes can first be found in Pissarro. The color theory, the tightly compacted strokes, the way the dots of paint coalesce into abstract patterns, even the stiff hieratic figures. One can trace in specific paintings what Seurat learned from Pissarro. Even as Pissarro engaged more of the human spirit and built a broader legacy. 1879, Seurat was doing very, very academic work and just learning about the avant-garde in Paris. But if you're familiar with Seurat's work, particularly his charcoal drawings, I think this will ring a bell. And if you're familiar with some of his later paintings, like Port en Besson at the Modern, which has these swirling abstract forms in the ocean or in the water, this is something he might have seen in Pissarro in, say, this painting of the mid-1870s called Hoarfrost. Pissarro recorded some thoughts on Seurat and Signac. In a letter in which he informs Lucien of the terrible, cruel news of Seurat's death and calls it a great loss for art. Seurat died in 1891 very suddenly of diphtheria. He was only about 30 years old, maybe less. Pissarro wrote, "There is a splendid exhibition of that unfortunate Seurat. Some marines as delicate as ever, somewhat white and weak in coloration, but very artistic. And a large canvas, a circus, which is excellently composed. A clown cut on the foreground dissatisfies us, but the work as a whole has the stamp of an original artist. It is something. Pissarro then criticizes the pointillistically painted blue and violet frames, which he finds disagreeable and discordant, not unlike the effect of plush. He also is incisive about Signac, who has some landscapes of the kind you know, very correct, well executed, but cold and monotonous. He has a bizarre portrait of Fénéon standing, holding a lily against a background of interlaced ribbons of color, which do not add to the decorative quality of the work and have no value from the point of view of sensation. He had a very complex meaning for the word sensation, and I'm not going to try to define it here. But that painting by Signac welcomes you to the modern, or did last time I was there, when the modern opened. I don't think they read Pissarro's criticism when they set that room up. In the 1890s, having found the rules of divisionism too constraining, Pissarro went on to develop a new extraordinary aesthetic density in his complex cityscapes, figure paintings, and landscapes. The young critic Félix Fénéon, the very one in the painting by Signac, wrote in the early 1890s, "It is this Pissarro we should be celebrating, master of forms. He bathes them forever in a translucent atmosphere and immortalizes by means of the benign and flexible hieratism he has just invented, their exalted interweave. Although less well known today than his earlier landscapes, these made a strong impact at the time, most notably on Henri Matisse. Remember, this is the 1890s, before Fauvism or Cubism. In the auspicious meeting in 1897 of this struggling young painter, Matisse, who would rightly come to be considered the greatest artist of the 20th century, with the living embodiment of painting's long journey in the 19th, Pissarro moved Matisse to tears. He came away likening Pissarro to the long-bearded figure of the prophet Moses as sculpted on the well or fountain of Moses, a well-known Gothic masterpiece in Dijon. Pissarro was indeed a Jew with a long white beard and a biblical mien, and Matisse was hardly the first to liken him to Moses. But Matisse may have been thinking less of the figure and more of the fountain, with Pissarro as a living source, a deep well of artistic knowledge, the fount of modern art, with a flowing generosity of spirit. He certainly also saw in Pissarro an exemplary survivor of a long, difficult life dedicated to art. Later on, when Pissarro was no longer so esteemed, Matisse spoke little of him and a lot about Cézanne. This, of course, is Pissarro and Matisse. Pissarro and Matisse. But it was Pissarro who introduced Matisse to Cézanne's significance. Matisse also saw the epical 1897 exhibition of Caillebot's Impressionist collection in Pissarro's company, undoubtedly garnering many a bon mot. This was the first time that the state of France recognized any of the Impressionists or Post-Impressionists. They were kind of forced to accept Caillebot's collection. Lucky for them. And in 1898, Matisse frequented Pissarro in the apartment the latter had rented to paint his views of the Tuileries. He spent many hours with Pissarro, learning as fast as Pissarro could teach, according to Hilary Sperling, Matisse's biographer. Matisse spent no time with any other major artist as mentor, and probably never met Cézanne. Pissarro was Matisse's master, present in his work in many ways, including some later attributed to Cézanne. The extraordinary sense of composition that animates Pissarro's painting throughout his life is certainly where Matisse's basic affinity with him is most clear. And of course, in the primacy of color. But even specific picture ideas and feelings can be traced. Gauguin, it is well known, was a major influence on Matisse. Pissarro thus again reaches Matisse and into the 20th century. Harmony was often referred to as a goal by Pissarro, and as a unique achievement by writers on him, particularly in the 1890s, when Matisse would have been most attentive. The top are Pissarro's drawings. This DNA of Pissarro, in her exhaustive biography of Matisse, Hilary Sperling emphasizes harmony, the goal Matisse desired more passionately than any other. This DNA of Pissarro persisted in Matisse through half a century and its art, in which harmony was otherwise hard to find. Pissarro was also still a presence in 1900 and 1901 when Pablo Picasso entered the Paris art world. And Pissarro's touch and inventions can be seen both in the dense little brushstrokes of the classical cubism associated with Picasso and Braque, and in the flat-colored planes of late cubism and geometric abstraction. You remember those flat-colored planes on the 1867 landscapes by Pissarro. There's also a famous tempera painting of sleeping peasants by Picasso, which could be compared to quite a number of sleeping peasants painted by Pissarro, almost as an homage. Although I have no idea if Picasso saw a lot of Pissarro, but he must have seen some because Pissarro was very well established in the art world in Paris in 1900 to 1904. And there were some major shows of Pissarro's work then. Many later painters, too, especially those who sought an abstraction free of the constrictions seen in Cézanne and Picasso and Cubism, carried a Pissarro gene, whether or not they were aware of it. This is a close-up of an 1898 painting of a Dieppe, market in Dieppe by Pissarro. The painting is probably about a yard wide, and this is probably about a third of the middle third. Georges Lecomte wrote of Pissarro in 1892. His researches even seem to preface The Art of Tomorrow. Testimonies to Pissarro's unique character have come down to us. Though not shy about his own work, he was neither a raging egotist nor a pushy self-promoter, two useful personas for an artist. On the contrary, he was generous in sharing his insights and is, as we have seen, unselfish in the support he gave others. The first thing that struck one in Pissarro, Ambroise Vollard observed, was his air of kindness, of delicacy, and at the same time of serenity. Thaddée Nathanson, editor of La Revue Blanche in the 1890s, recalled him as infallible, infinitely kind and just. In the phrase of Christopher Lloyd, whose writings in recent decades have contributed greatly to the revival of Pissarro, he played an almost rabbinical role in French painting. Unfortunately, history finds personality an easier subject than art, and Pissarro's personality has on occasion been invoked either to diminish or conversely to justify his work, in both cases with a distorting effect. Sometimes his art has been dismissed simply because of his reputation as a great character and teacher. Pissarro's long-lived enthusiasm for anarchism has been held against him, despite his clear allegiance only to art and compassion. As late as 1939, Leonello Venturi wrote, "Another mistake of Pissarro's in which is manifest a certain pretension to socialist political activity." Deprecating a pastel of peasant women chatting under a tree. Leonello Venturi, by the way, was the co-compiler of the Pissarro Catalogue Raisonné. I guess it was just a job for Venturi. By contrast, in our own age, his anarchism has counted for him and made him easy prey to postmodern writers on art. Thus, in a 1999 essay, the influential Marxist art historian T.J. Clark committed 80 pages of exotic political exegesis to a pointless effort to attach Pissarro's art to the far-left politics of his time and ours. Note I said his art, not Pissarro. Clark sort of owned up to the pointlessness, though he didn't want to admit it loudly. As hidden in the middle of the essay, he finally said of the art, "I see no outright socialist politics in it." Even though he was trying to convince us it was submerged in it. Clark's plight may bring to mind Rainer Maria Rilke's struggle to write on Cézanne in 1907. Rilke observed he had gone to Paris to see the art, and he meant that in a large sense. When Pissarro wrote in 1891, "I firmly believe that our ideas impregnated with anarchist philosophy mark our works and make them antipathetic to the ideas of the moment." The context was his criticism of the art of Gauguin and his followers, the synthetists and the nabis, an art of religious, mystical, mysterious ideas, religious symbolists, religious socialism, art of ideas, occultism, Buddhism, etc., superstitious beliefs, as opposed to his art, a sane art based on sensations and on modern ideas, an art that is honest. He is contrasting invidiously the influence on visual art of contemporary political ideas, retardataire literary concerns, and archaic language, with the developing unique visual language of painting, his language. This rings a bell in our current time. Look at this middle of this painting in particular. Then there's Pissarro's Jewishness. Did it play a role in the eclipse of his stature? Though Pissarro did not participate in religious formalities, he never dissimulated his Jewish identity. To all appearances, he enjoyed it. But anti-Semitism was rife in all social classes in the France of the 1860s and later, despite the constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion instituted under Napoleon I. By the 1890s, when France had become a republic, there were anti-Semitic riots during the panic over anarchism, and then during the Dreyfus Affair. The avant-garde was itself tinged with anti-Semitism. Cézanne himself, so deeply indebted to Pissarro, took the side of the anti-Dreyfusards, the side fueled by anti-Semitism. Both Degas and Renoir, old friends and admirers of Pissarro, disparaged him in anti-Semitic terms and worried about being associated with him. Here is Renoir in 1882. To continue with the Israelite Pissarro, that taints you with revolution. Pissarro, ever generous and conciliatory, gave Renoir the benefit of the doubt, though it is not clear he deserved it. Pissarro assumed Renoir was embarrassed by his own outbursts and attributed his worst expressions to his brother. In an 1882 letter, Pissarro wrote Monet, "The younger brother of Renoir is really insufferable. This wretched Renoir has mistreated me in the worst way. It seems that I am a prime schemer without talent, a mercenary Jew, playing tricks to supplant you, mon cher, and Renoir. The dangerous aspect of it is the dispute he stirs up, the discord he tries to provoke. My friends know what to believe, but it has cast suspicion on Renoir the painter, who certainly does not deserve it. Is it because I am an intruder in the group?" Intruder? What made Pissarro, the consummate insider, perhaps malgré lui, feel like the outsider to his own milieu? What, indeed? Still, one can make too much of this. Anti-Semitism does not appear to have been the main determinant in the avant-garde's view of Pissarro. He was, to say the very least, accepted as one among them. Indeed, it is possible that some of Pissarro's contemporaries considered his Jewishness an important and positive element in what he brought, both to the art of painting and to the art of human existence. "Hail Moses, he carries the tablets of the law," was how Edmond Duranty, writing in L'Artiste in 1880, characterized Pissarro's role in the artistic discussions at the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes. In likening Pissarro to Moses, the giver of the law, Duranty, Matisse, and others were undoubtedly paying tribute not only to his new way of seeing, but to his way of living, moral, responsible, whole. I would like to speculate as well that Pissarro brought to modern art a Talmudic bent of mind when European culture, still refreshed by the Enlightenment, was especially receptive to such thinking and its artistic embodiment. Modern art has a creative way of treating previous art as a text from which to work, producing fresh art. This process long antedates the fetish that postmodernism has made out of it. And modernism has shown it can be done in the visual language of art without the crutch of verbal theory. Penultimately, need I point out that the cultural milieu that might have preserved more of Pissarro's reputation was all but wiped out by the Nazis. Pissarro's story brings to mind many questions about the history of art. Since 1980, much of the writing on Pissarro has implicitly conceded his primacy, but not his preeminence. The MoMA catalog, in discussing one of the exhibit's paintings, observes, "It sounds almost as if Cézanne was borrowing Pissarro's eyes." Or again, "Every work produced by Cézanne at that point appears to refer to an earlier painting by Pissarro." This diffidence, almost as if, appears to refer, is hardly necessary. Many of Pissarro's great contemporaries considered him the greatest of them all, and anyone looking today for the true sources of modern painting, perhaps of its future as well as its past, can find them most wholly and harmoniously present in him. Just as Barnett Newman was right in 1953 to decry the false history that holds Cézanne to be the father of modern art, Cézanne himself was right in maintaining we are all derived from Pissarro.